Welcome back, everyone, to Stay in Your Lane. I'm your host, John Maley, brought to you by Triple T Transport. We're going to pick this bout up again, continuing from yesterday's episode. Last time we spoke about equipment, there was still plenty of carriers that needed to replace equipment that just couldn't get it during the pandemic because it was unavailable and extremely high priced. Now we're in a position where rates in the market is down. I want to say outbound tender rejections down under 3%. So we think that there's still going to be a lot of fallout for the next 9 to 12 months is what we're.
Well said. Yes.
All right. Well, then we're on the same page. Dan, coming back to you on this one. How does your age group change how you see or feel the impact of the economic conditions we're going through right now? And let me add a little bit. For the guys here that work with us at Triple T, the guys that are under 30, 32 years old, they've only known interest rates to be more than low from what I've seen in my lifetime, and I'm going to hit the 5.0 this year. So, I remember the 80s when a home mortgage at times were double digits. And I remember, my first home purchase where, if you got 7, you did good. You were winning, right? In 2010, we saw a 40-year low in the 3 and 4% range. How do you see that changing the impact on the people in the United States because of their age group? You've got guys that are going to be retiring within 10 years. You got us middle-agers out there like myself versus the young people. What do you have on that, Dan?
You're absolutely right. You quote young people, and I think you pegged it as 32. That's about right because those people haven't seen basically anything but near zero rates for the last 14 years. Now, there was a 2-year period in there where their rates were a little bit higher, but it's basically been near zero for 14 years. And inflation has been 2% or less for 14 years. So these are the conditions that have been influencing younger business people. The perfect effect we saw a few weeks ago with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. What happened there was they had depositors leaving, and how you cover that? Well, you have to sell some assets to cover that. Well, guess what? Those assets were long-term bonds. When interest rates go up, those bonds leave value, and it's like, we didn't know interest rates could go up. This is just it's a perfect example of not being aware that rates can go up and they can get higher. And by the way, you mentioned mortgages. They were at 1.18%. I do presentations. I ask people, did you ever have a mortgage like that? And sometimes people say, yeah, I had 20%. So that was certainly a different area. Now, as far as retirement, it's always dependent on your risk tolerance and your age. So if you are towards the end of your career and looking towards retirement and you have a nest egg, well, the good news is you're finally getting some interest on your nest egg. So you may want to leave that there and get interest. Anytime you have a bigger exposure to stocks, you have a bigger risk. If you're younger and are trying to build a nest egg, then you buy and hold. You're more aggressive on the equity side. So you don't care so much in the long term about interest rates because equity growth over the next, going forward is going to average 10% or so. That's what it's done for decades and decades. Interest rates will go up and down, so what earnings go up and down, and the stock market will go up and down. But if you buy and hold for the long term, then maybe movements in interest rates aren't quite so interesting. You shouldn't go shifting in and out of equities. And by the way, probably a longer answer than you want, but to demonstrate buy and hold, there's a study looking at the stock market over a period of 20 years. And it turns out the biggest movements are in a handful of days. So over a 20-year period, if you miss the best 10 days in 20 years, your return is cut in half. So don't try to get in and out of the market just because you think you might know where.
Very good. Bob, coming back to you on this one. Thank you again, Dan. Trade agreements, as far as imports, diversions away from Southern California ports, LA, Long Beach, how does it impact the carriers and the lanes from a short and a long-term perspective? Because we've seen a shift to the imports where they were concerned and chose to come to a different port and different area of the country. Are they staying or are they going back?
So I was just looking at this data recently. It was really interesting. So first of all, go back to what I said earlier, and that is retailers in particular are trying to clear out all that bloated inventory that they had accumulated as the consumer went back to buying more services like travel and less goods that we did during the pandemic. And retailers were caught with way too much stuff. They've been working that off, and it's one of the reasons why truck freight has been weak, but it's also a reason why port volumes have generally been weak. But to your point, the West Coast ports are getting hit harder than the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. So I was just looking at some data report from the ports. In the month of February, West Coast import volumes were down 37%. East Coast and Gulf Coast ports were down less than 20%. Still down like 18-19%, but not nearly the 37% that was on the West Coast. I think even Seattle Tacoma was down 40%. I mean, that side's been hit much harder. Funny enough, Houston is actually positive. So, anyways, yes, some of that is going on, and that will obviously have an impact on how far and where freight is moving, and then the carriers that service that. So we have been seeing that. But then you've been talking about seaports. Again, I'm going to go back to this idea. The land ports of entry are doing much better. And that's because, we're seeing some of this reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever you want to call it. Not only did the Trump administration push this, but the Biden administration is pushing it as well. And so now it's one of the few things that it seems like Republicans and Democrats can unify on against China and sort of more North American, I won't call it all U.S., but North American production and so forth. So, and we know a lot of that. I mean, over 70% of the freight moved across the U.S.-Mexico borders on truck, closer to 60% with Canada. So, so that will benefit a lot of those carriers. And again, we've seen trade with Mexico be very strong with trucks, and Laredo is right up there at the top. They're some of the best freight right now. So so yeah, it's continuing. I don't see this changing. I don't see, even if you have administration changes, I think this is one of the few things that here in Washington that people are unified on. And I think you're gonna, we push production, and of course, Dan was talking about inflation. This impacts inflation. We exported our inflation for years, right? We exported it to production in Asia and China specifically. As you bring some of that back, even in Mexico, the production costs are higher. So that will have an impact longer term on inflation rates as well. But it's certainly something that's going to impact supply chains.
Well, and I've talked to some of the shippers in California with the produce is the big concern, because I think the weather's just been so bad. It's been brutal with the amount of rain and weather they've dealt with. A lot of what they normally grew early in the year here is going to be coming from the south. So that's going to put more pressure on the Mexican side.
That's a good point. And
Laredo, Edinburgh, FAR, they're going to get hit hard. Your Florida and Georgia markets are probably going to be pretty strong. What we're seeing though is the retail restaurant versus restaurant, grocery stores are killing it. They're still killing it. The restaurants have not recovered.
I know what you're saying, and I've seen a little bit of that too. It's a little surprising. I think some of the retail numbers in restaurants have been doing well, but that's also, I think, inflation impacted, right? So as prices go up, it looks like and sales are going up. That's having an impact. But we've seen, in general, to your point, I mean, we haven't seen this in contract freight. I haven't seen this big drop. I've seen a bit of a drop off, but I haven't seen this plunge in freight. But all that extra freight out there is gone.
There are shippers out there, let's face it, that got hurt, taken advantage of and paid top dollar to get freight moved. And some of those shippers are trying to get it back. We're seeing the strategic, versus transactional. The strategic players are more consistent. So, we've actually gained market share, I think, with some of those relationships that we have versus, we worked in the spot market for our people that were giving us contract freight at Triple T Transport, right? You're going to take care of, we're going to dance with who we came to the party with, right? It's a difficult balance to navigate and to know how it's going to play out long term. But I would agree that the grocery stores are leading the charge. I think they've had a couple good years from a profits perspective. Restaurant business, at least here where we are locally, there's some busy times in the restaurants, but most of the time it's not lunch. And I'd say that's because many people are still working from home post-pandemic.
Yeah, you just need to go to where I always get lunch, and the line's out the door. I tell those people.
Is it good?
Yeah, well, that's probably part of the reason why the line's out the door.
A bunch of guys hanging out there and the line's out the door. That means the food's good. Definitely. Let's move this one on to the next question. We saw a large acquisition. Bob, this one's coming back to you for your thoughts. Saw a large acquisition. Knight and Swift are going to be merging and taking and purchasing U.S. Express. I don't really look for details on that specific situation, but do you see more of that coming throughout the year with the bigger players?
Yeah, I think there's the potential for that. A lot of time, why does, and I'm not talking about that specific acquisition, but in general, why would they buy another fleet? They're drivers, right? They want their drivers for the most part. And there's still some of that. The driver market's gotten a little bit better, but we still have issues because, inability to pass a drug test and driving records and so forth. So maybe it's not quite as tight as it was, and it's not, but it's certainly not super loose either. There are plenty of fleets out there looking to do nips and tucks and acquisitions and so forth. One of the interesting things that's happened though over the last 3 to 5 years is it used to be a fleet would go in and buy a company and you'd rebrand everything and you'd fold it in. Now that doesn't happen so much, right? It goes in and it's like, hey John, you've been doing a great job running this truck fleet. We're going to buy you, but just keep doing what you're doing. You're going to run under your brand. We're going to, but we now own you. And that is, I think, more likely what you're going to see in a lot of these. It used to be, so you go out there and you would acquire a well-run fleet, maybe where you can still use some back office stuff that makes some savings, but that's more of the norm that we're seeing in this space. And I think that's going to continue. But I do think those well-capitalized companies are going to continue to look for opportunities. But the truckload market is still highly fragmented, right? I mean,
92 to 94% have 1 to 5 trucks.
Yeah, I mean, another way I look at it is, the top 25 fleets have a combined market share of less than 10%. I mean, that's pretty astounding.
Absolutely. We'll go ahead and put a pencil in this for today, guys, and we're going to pick it back up tomorrow.
Continue watching on the next episode of the Stay in Your Lane podcast.